I wasn't blindsided by what was happening, but that didn't make it any easier to carry. Knowing something is coming doesn't mean you're ready when it finally arrives. The distance had been growing for months, slow and deliberate, like someone backing away without turning around. The small jabs came first. Sarcastic comments, dismissive looks, a complete lack of respect in how she spoke to me, especially when she thought no one else was listening. Then came the refusal of intimacy in every form, not just physical. No warmth, no affection, no interest in connection of any kind. At some point, you stop asking and start observing, and what I saw told me everything I needed to know. She was either already involved with someone else, seriously thinking about it, or she had simply decided she was done being my wife. I'd reached a point where I had almost accepted that the marriage was over. She had made that acceptance easier by turning our home into a place I no longer recognized. Every conversation felt like a chore. Every shared space felt tense. What I couldn't understand was her refusal to just leave. If you're done, then be done. Say it out loud. Pack your things. Walk away. Dragging it out felt unnecessary and cruel, like she wanted to make sure every remaining day hurt before it ended. I kept asking myself why she wouldn't just pull the plug, and the only answer that made sense was control. She wanted out, but she also wanted to dictate how it happened and what she walked away with. Money wasn't something I tried to hide or manipulate because there wasn't much to work with. We lived in a house without a mortgage, but not because we were well off. The place had belonged to my grandmother, and after she passed, my parents suggested we move in rather than let it sit empty. Even then, something about the timing made me uneasy. I was already noticing changes in my wife, things that didn't sit right with me. So before we ever unpacked fully, I had a long talk with my parents. We agreed the house would stay in their names for at least another year, just to be safe. It wasn't about scheming. It was about protecting what little stability I had left. Before that, we had owned our own place, or more accurately, shared ownership with a bank that expected its payment every month. We lived there for just under 6 years. It wasn't a bad house. We talked about raising kids there someday. That future ended one night because of carelessness. She'd been drinking, more than usual, and fell asleep with several candles still burning. One was close enough to the curtains that it didn't take long for fabric to catch. The smoke alarms woke her just in time for her to escape, but by then the fire had already taken hold. When the fire department arrived, I got there moments later and immediately warned them about the firearms and ammunition stored inside. I didn't want anyone hurt because of something I owned. Not long after, the heat caused a few rounds to go off. That was enough for the firefighters to pull back and let the structure burn itself out. One of my closest friends happened to be the station supervisor that night, and the report reflected what was obvious. By the time they arrived, the house was already beyond saving. The insurance company still paid out. After everything was settled, we walked away with a little over $24,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than I expected. We took it and temporarily moved into a friend's place while we figured out what came next. After expenses, we had around $15,000 left. If we split, she would have walked away with half, enough to get herself started somewhere else. I planned to stay right where I was. Over the following weeks, I quietly took care of a few loose ends. Nothing illegal, nothing dishonest, just preparation. I knew the way things were heading, and I wasn't going to let myself be caught flat-footed when it finally collapsed. I worked later hours than she did, and winter meant darkness came early. One evening, I pulled into the driveway and immediately noticed something was off. Her car wasn't in the garage and the porch light wasn't on. Inside, the house was silent. I called her name. No answer. I moved through the rooms until I found her in the bedroom, standing at her vanity, carefully applying makeup. She was wearing a black dress I'd never seen before. It wasn't subtle. It was shorter, tighter, and cut lower than anything she'd ever worn for me. I stood there for a moment, watching her reflection ignore me completely. Finally, I asked if we were going somewhere. She answered without turning around. She had plans. When she finally looked at me, she said it plainly. She had a date with another man. She waited, watching my face, clearly expecting an explosion that never came. I just looked at her. The silence made her uncomfortable. She repeated herself, louder this time, as if volume would change the meaning of what she'd said. I told her no. She looked genuinely confused, like the word didn't register. I explained that she was free to do whatever she wanted once she moved out, but not while we were still living under the same roof. I told her I would file the paperwork as soon as possible and suggested she pack a few things and stay somewhere else for a couple of days so I could get everything lined up. We could talk calmly after that about how to divide what little there was to divide. Her response was a sharp, ugly laugh. She said she wasn't leaving. According to her, I was the one who needed to go. She liked the house. She planned to keep it. And if things got ugly, she made it clear she'd do whatever she had to do to make sure she walked away with most of the money when everything was forced to be sold. She even suggested I move back in with my parents and stay out of her way until it was over. When I told her she needed to leave instead, her tone shifted from smug to threatening. She said she'd be gone in about half an hour and warned me not to be there when she got back. If I was, she'd call the police. She claimed she could say whatever she needed to say to get me arrested and removed. Then she went back to fixing her lipstick bright red, like the conversation was finished and the outcome already decided. I smiled, and that seemed to rattle her more than anything else I could have done. I left the bedroom without another word. There was no point arguing with someone who had already decided how the story would end. I knew her well enough to know she wouldn't have the nerve to let her date pick her up at the house. She cared too much about appearances. That meant she was planning to drive and meet him somewhere else, probably somewhere public enough to feel safe and private enough to feel exciting. As I walked through the garage, I noticed the aluminum bat leaning in the corner. It was an old one I used during summer leagues years ago, scarred and dented but still solid. I picked it up without hesitation. 4 clean swings were all it took, headlights first, then taillights. Glass shattered quietly in the cold air. That car wasn't going anywhere under its own power. When I stepped back inside, I saw her purse sitting on the kitchen counter. I opened it out of simple curiosity and immediately wished I hadn't. Everything I needed to know was right there. I pulled out her phone, closed the purse carefully, and walked back into the garage. I didn't want to make a mess. I removed the battery, set the phone on the workbench, and smashed it cleanly into pieces with a hammer. When I was done, I reassembled what I could without the battery and placed it back where I'd found it. I considered tampering with the rest of what was in the purse, then stopped. I didn't need to give her anything else to twist or accuse me of later. She came storming into the kitchen a few minutes later, carrying shoes with heels so high I didn't know how she planned to walk in them. When she saw me calmly pouring coffee, her face twisted in anger. She screamed at me to get out, pointing toward the door like she owned the place. I took my time, sipped my coffee, and said nothing. That silence seemed to push her over the edge. She threatened to call the police and claimed she feared for her safety. I reminded her calmly and clearly that I hadn't touched her, threatened her, or raised my voice. I'd simply refused to be forced out of my own home. She stomped off toward the door. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard screaming from outside. She burst back in, fury written all over her face, demanding to know what I'd done to her car. I told her she shouldn't leave a vehicle unattended on the street and shrugged. She stared at me for a long moment, then announced she'd call her date to come get her and make a show of it just to spite me. That confidence vanished the moment she realized her phone didn't work. Her voice rose another octave as she stomped back into the bedroom, returning in sneakers and clutching her heels. I wished her a pleasant evening as she left, still shouting curses as she went down the street. What she didn't know was that I'd already made a phone call of my own. I'd called my mother as soon as she left the house, and she understood immediately. She contacted the neighbors, quietly explaining that there might be trouble and to be cautious. I grew up on that street. Everyone knew me. Everyone trusted me. About 20 minutes later, the police arrived. One of the officers, a woman named Dana Brooks, was someone I'd gone to high school with. I invited both officers inside and offered them coffee. They declined but seemed uncomfortable, like they already suspected something wasn't adding up. I asked them what they saw that suggested a disturbance. No broken furniture, no injuries, no signs of a struggle. Dana explained the complaint they'd received. I nodded, then showed them the video recordings I'd made earlier that evening. The room went quiet as they watched. When it ended, both officers exchanged looks. Dana told me I had several options and advised me to file for a restraining order first thing in the morning. She also suggested securing the house and calling immediately if my wife returned. Before leaving, she warned me not to escalate things, no matter how tempting it might be. While we were talking, my wife was circling the house outside, watching from the shadows. She must have seen the police leave and decided this was her chance. She slipped into the garage with the idea of taking my vehicle instead. The problem was she'd tossed her keys on the kitchen counter earlier and couldn't get back inside. That's when she spotted the spare set on the workbench. She grabbed them and climbed into the old four-wheel drive truck I only used for hauling and winter storms. It was loud, heavy, and unforgiving if mishandled. What she didn't know was that I'd disconnected the garage door opener earlier just in case. She fired up the engine, hit the button, waited a second, and then floored it, assuming the door was open. It was. The truck slammed backward through the garage, tearing metal and wood apart, and launched straight into the front of the police cruiser parked outside. The impact shoved the car several feet. One of the officers was just stepping out and was knocked hard to the ground. The scene turned into chaos instantly. Dana reacted faster than I thought possible. She pulled my wife out of the truck, cuffed her, and called for emergency assistance. Her partner was unconscious, bleeding, and not moving. I rushed over and did what I could to keep him still and breathing until help arrived. It felt like an eternity before the first ambulance showed up. Soon after, the street filled with flashing lights. Every officer on duty seemed to be there. My wife was taken away in an ambulance as well, bruised and shaken but conscious. I gave my statement more times than I could count. Because it was a small town, I knew several of the officers personally, including the one supervising the scene, who had coached my youth baseball team years earlier. He told me they didn't yet know how serious the injured officer's condition was, but that it looked worse than they'd hoped. He also told me, quietly, that my wife was being charged with everything they could reasonably attach. That night stretched on until exhaustion finally set in. I went home to a quiet house, secured every door, and sat alone at the kitchen table long after sunrise, knowing nothing about my life would ever be the same again. The aftermath didn't hit all at once. It unfolded in layers, each one heavier than the last. By the next morning, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. My wife had been released on bond after draining almost everything left in our joint account. She took just over $17,000, leaving me barely enough to cover immediate expenses. She needed it, apparently, to repay her parents for posting bail and to retain an attorney who specialized in cases that already looked bad before they even reached a courtroom. Because of the restraining order, we didn't speak directly again. Every word passed through lawyers, filtered and reshaped into something cold and procedural. Our first legal meeting was a disaster for her. I came prepared. My parents attended with me because their involvement wasn't optional. Their names were on the house, and that mattered more than she realized. Her attorney laid out her demands confidently, like he expected resistance but not collapse. She wanted the house, or at least half of its value. She had already arranged, without my knowledge, for a friend in real estate to purchase it cheaply and sell it back to her later. She assumed I'd be cornered into agreeing. My lawyer calmly slid a document across the table. Her attorney read it once, then again. The color drained from his face as he explained that she couldn't claim half of something she never legally owned. She exploded. The room filled with shouting until the judge threatened to clear it. When things settled, she moved on to her next demand. She wanted all the furnishings: living room set, dining furniture, bedroom pieces, kitchen appliances. My lawyer responded with receipts and bank records. Everything had been paid for by my father, every single item, purchased openly, legally, and documented. The only concession offered was sentimental. She could choose one bedroom set to take with her. Nothing else belonged to her. By the end of that meeting, nearly everything she thought she was entitled to was out of reach. The criminal side moved faster than the divorce. Filing a false police report didn't sit well with the department, especially after an officer had been injured. Using a vehicle in a reckless manner sealed it. Some charges were eventually reduced or dropped, not because they lacked merit but because the court didn't want to overload the case. In the end, she avoided jail time but received a year of probation and mandatory counseling. It wasn't mercy. It was efficiency. The divorce itself wrapped up quickly after that. The judge reviewed the documentation, glanced at me, and didn't bother hiding his reaction. He commented that I'd clearly anticipated this outcome, even if I hadn't predicted the exact path. I told him the truth. I didn't plan chaos. I planned protection. I offered to walk away from the money she took if she signed and ended it cleanly. The judge accepted the agreement and finalized the divorce. Just like that, it was over. A month later, I ran into her by chance at a grocery store. She wanted to talk. We sat at a small table with drinks between us like strangers. She asked why I'd been so cold. I asked when she decided the marriage stopped mattering. She admitted she hadn't been happy for years and blamed everything on resentment she never voiced. She said she wanted to hurt me, not leave me. I told her that was the problem. We stood up, wished each other well, and walked away without saying goodbye. Years passed. Life settled into something quieter and steadier. I stayed busy, rebuilt routines, and learned to trust peace again. I crossed paths with Officer Brooks at a public event not long after she recovered fully. We talked. Then we talked again. Friendship came first. Respect followed. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Eventually, it turned into something real. We married after taking our time, building something based on honesty instead of tension. We raised children. We built a home that felt safe. I heard updates about my ex through distant connections. She remarried twice. The second marriage seemed stable. I hoped she'd learned something from the wreckage she left behind, not for my sake but for her own. Years later, I stood in my grandmother's old house again, this time handing the keys to my daughter as a wedding gift. My wife and I had moved into my parents' farmhouse after they passed, a place with wide rooms and long memories. Watching my children build their own lives felt like closure I hadn't known I needed. Some stories end with revenge. This one didn't. It ended with distance, lessons learned, and a future built on better choices. That was enough. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, like the video and leave a comment. Your support helps the channel grow.